Another thing that we really need to understand about culture is that it is constantly changing. Did you see that? So when we talk about cultural change, we have a whole bunch of different words that we can use to talk about cultural change. And I just want to reiterate some of those terms right now. If you have me in the summer class, they may not be in your textbook, but in the regular textbook that I typically use, these terms should be in there. So what are some terms we have for cultural change? The first one is cultural adaptation. In cultural adaptation, a culture is forced to change or adapt to new circumstances. It might be they're invaded by some outside country and they have to change. It might be a new technology. It might be something like global warming, right? The idea is that the culture will have to shift or adapt to whatever the particular change is. So I like to think of the example of, the fact that people have these phones on them now that are just, your everything phone. It's not really just a phone, right? It might have a compass in it. It might be your flashlight. It's your calendar. You play games on it. You take pictures on it. So it's your camera. I'm recording my video on my phone right now. It's sort of this all-purpose device. Our lives are very different with everybody having these all-purpose devices on them all the time. We have undergone a cultural adaptation. So I want you to be conscientious of that. What are some other examples of that? How much has our life changed because of the one example I'm giving you of the handheld cellular, I don't even think they call it cellular, wireless phone. So culture shock occurs when you go into a dramatically different culture. So for example, if I went to China, I wouldn't know the culture, the language, the food. Maybe some of you all have had an experience like that where you go to a different culture and you don't understand what's going on because you are experiencing this culture shock. Cultural lag occurs when one part of a culture changes faster or slower than another part of a culture. So for example, maybe young people change faster than old people. I think we're seeing some of that right now. If you look at the current social movements around things like racial inequality and social justice and climate change, the baby boomer generation and the Gen Z generation and millennials are not on the same page as each other about their views on these things. Maybe we are experiencing some cultural lag. A lot of times the law doesn't change as fast as the culture does. So if you have a new technology, sometimes we have to change our laws to keep up with that. That happened when texting and driving was a problem. We didn't have the ability to text people on our phones before, and all of a sudden this distracted driving thing happened. And in that moment we were having these car accidents and we didn't have good social etiquette about it because we were experiencing cultural lag. The technology got ahead of the culture. Cultural diffusion occurs when one culture spreads to another culture. So a great example of that is McDonald's is kind of diffused all over the world. Only in America do we send our worst food to other people. Meanwhile, food from other cultures has diffused into the US. Now, if you eat burritos and tacos, and that's very common in this country and very American. When my parents were growing up, that was like, exotic food. So when cultures are sort of spreading out to other cultures, they are diffusing. All of this change is constantly happening. So, I use the example of, things like in vitro fertilization or foods. We are always getting new things and our culture's always shifting. So it's very important to keep in mind, your culture is going to change over time, and it's going to change from one place to another. It's never going to be exactly the same. It's going to shift. So we're in a moment, I think, of major shift in the U.S., and this is culture change that we're going through, maybe even a little bit of culture shock. So a couple other terms, real culture and ideal culture. The real culture is how the culture actually is. The ideal culture is how the culture would like to see itself. So for example, we say we're America, land of the free, home of the brave. We believe in liberty, freedom for all. well, we were a country that had slavery. We were a country that committed genocide against Native Americans. We didn't allow women to vote until the 1920s. I mean, like, I don't, that didn't match up, right? Our real culture, how we really were, didn't match up with these ideals that we had. And I think you see that a lot, you know. You have this ideal, the way people want to see themselves, and then you have kind of what we really are like as a culture. Language is a very important element of any culture. And I think it's very important to think about how language, your culture shapes your language, and then your language ends up shaping how you see the world. And so an example I like to use is in the US, we're a very car-oriented culture. We got a million different terms for a vehicle that gets you from one place to another. We got a sedan, a minivan, a full-size van, a sports car, crossover. We got all these different terms for all these different types of cars. If you were to go to Cambodia or Mongolia or some rural area in, say, the Sahara Desert, they might have 1 or 2 or 3 words for these different kinds of vehicles. Maybe there's like a car and a truck and a bus. But here, it's such a huge part of who we are that when we look at a car, we don't just see a bus, we don't just see a vehicle, we see all of these different complex, complicated diversities of cars. And that brings me to another very important point. Ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. If someone or something is ethnocentric, they believe that their own culture is normal, natural, and superior. So ethnocentrism is when you believe your own culture is normal, natural, and superior. Cultural relativism is when you believe that all cultures should be judged based on their own standards. So you're not holding up your culture as the standard, you're judging every culture based on its standards and its values. There's a big tension in sociology over these two things. On the one hand, if you're being ethnocentric, you're sort of being arrogant and you're not being very open-minded, and you might be missing something if you're a sociologist who is ethnocentric. But cultural relativism has its own set of problems, and one of the places where we see this is in this debate around female circumcision, or circumcision in general. In the United States, male circumcision is considered socially acceptable and not a problem, but female circumcision is considered a bad or illegal thing. There are other cultures where both men and women, or boys and girls, are circumcised. Many of my students are not even familiar with female circumcision, and many of them sort of automatically are like, oh, that's horrible, not sort of thinking about the fact that we cut babies' genitals here too without their consent. And so I want you to step back, and we can talk more about this face to face in the discussion, and think about how your ethnocentrism might influence how you view other cultures. We all have a little bit of it. You know, most of you all don't want to eat a dog or a horse. And that would be an example of where you might be ethnocentric. And it really impacts our morality when we think this way. The other term is cultural universals. A cultural universal is something that exists in every culture. So for example, every culture has a system of partnering or pairing off. We often call that marriage here. There are different types of marriage, it might be polygamous or monogamous, but every culture has that. Every culture has frowns and smiles, meaning something similar. And one thing that every culture has is the incest taboo. You are not allowed to marry your immediate family members. That is considered bad or wrong, and pretty much every culture doesn't allow you to marry your mom. So I would not recommend trying to marry your mom anywhere, or marrying your children. A subculture is a culture within a culture. So most cultures have what's called a dominant culture. A dominant culture is the culture that has the most influence on the society. So in the United States, for example, middle-class white America is the dominant culture. Subcultures are cultures within that culture that have something that sort of makes them slightly different. So for example, Jewish Americans are a subculture. So in thinking about different types of subcultures, I've listed some here. Different jobs have different subcultures. Different racial or ethnic groups have different subcultures. Different religious groups do. Different political groups. Keep in mind the dominant political groups are the Democrats and the Republicans. But if you're like an anarchist or something like that, or one of those militia people that wants to take over Montana, that would be a political subculture. Different social classes, middle class people, wealthy people, poor people have their own subcultures. Different geographic regions, south versus north versus west, have their own subcultures. And then the other term you might see is a deviant subculture. That's one that purposely goes against the norms of the dominant culture. So when we meet together or when we're in the chat, we can talk about what might be some of the most common types of subcultures that people are part of.